The room was thick with the kind of silence that follows arrogance, the kind that doesn't just sting but leaves an echo. Richard Posner, a man long regarded as a towering intellect in American law, leaned back with the faintest smirk and let the words slip like a dagger. "She's nothing more than a fake lawyer." The phrase wasn't delivered with anger. It was worse than that. It was delivered with casual disdain, as though it were fact, as though the career and credibility of Jasmine Crockett could be dismissed with a single sneer. The insult hung in the air, poisonous, as if he had thrown down a gauntlet for everyone to see. Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes steadied, her jaw tightened, and in that stillness, viewers watching later would swear they could see the weight of centuries pressing in. The old guard sneering at the new, privilege mocking perseverance, arrogance trying to erase legitimacy. For a moment, it wasn't just Jasmine he was speaking to. It was every woman who had ever been told she didn't belong in the courtroom. Every immigrant child who had been told their family's sacrifices meant nothing. Every young black professional who had worked twice as hard for half the recognition. In Posner's smug words, a generation of struggle heard the familiar refrain of dismissal. Gasps rippled across the audience. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered furiously, their eyes darting between the judge and the congresswoman, wondering how she would respond. Social media would soon be ablaze with outrage, but in that moment the world wanted to know, would she crumble under the weight of a legacy jurist's insult, or would she rise? Crockett didn't rush. She didn't spit fire back at him. Instead, she let the silence deepen, an unspoken reminder that dignity sometimes says more than fury ever could. Her restraint was a power all its own, an opening act in a drama that was only just beginning. Because what Posner hadn't counted on was that Jasmine Crockett's record, her courtroom battles, her victories carved from persistence and principle, was unassailable. The insult was meant to diminish her. Instead, it would magnify the truth of who she was. But what Posner didn't realize, her courtroom victories were about to speak louder than any insult he could hurl. For those unfamiliar with the players, the clash might have seemed like a fleeting exchange of words. But in truth, this was no ordinary insult, and these were no ordinary figures. Richard Posner was not just another retired judge. He was a towering name in legal circles, a man whose sharp pen and uncompromising critiques had shaped decades of judicial thought. His authority carried the weight of tradition, of the old institutions that had long dictated who was worthy and who was not. When Posner dismissed Jasmine Crockett as a fake lawyer, it wasn't just personal, it was emblematic. It was the voice of entrenched power telling a new generation, "You do not belong here." And then there was Crockett. She wasn't simply another politician navigating Washington's corridors. She was a woman who had clawed her way from the courtroom trenches to the halls of Congress, a product of resilience and relentless work. Her career wasn't born from privilege or patronage. It was born from long nights, relentless cases, and the lived reality of representing communities too often overlooked. To call her fake was to call every one of those battles meaningless. It was to erase not just her, but the voices of those she had carried into courtrooms when no one else would listen. The insult therefore took on symbolic weight far heavier than the smirk Posner intended. It became the clash of two Americas, the old guard, draped in robes of prestige and arrogance, versus the emerging leaders who carried stories of struggle, diversity, and unyielding faith in justice. It was a clash between gatekeepers and groundbreakers, between exclusion and inclusion, between the idea that legitimacy is inherited and the reality that legitimacy is earned. Viewers who saw the clip online didn't just see a judge insulting a congresswoman. They saw a line in the sand. They felt that familiar ache of dismissal, the casual cruelty of someone telling them their work, their sacrifice, their place in society was nothing but pretense. The sting wasn't confined to Crockett alone. It reverberated across communities hungry for recognition and weary of being undermined. This is why the stakes mattered so deeply. Crockett's response wouldn't simply be her own defense. It would be a defense for everyone watching who had ever been belittled. Her silence in that moment, her refusal to be rattled, hinted at something larger. She wasn't going to play into Posner's script. She wasn't going to answer insult with insult. She would answer with something far more devastating. Because in politics, in law, and in life, words may wound, but proof, lived and undeniable, cuts deeper. The coming confrontation wasn't going to be settled by clever comebacks. It was going to be settled by Crockett's record, by the victories she had already stacked like bricks against the storm of doubt. And so the insult metastasized into a question that spread far beyond that room. Could someone so casually dismissed truly redefine the narrative? Could courtroom victories outshine the shadow of a man who had spent a lifetime commanding respect? The answer would not come immediately. It would build, step by step, case by case, moment by moment, until the arrogance of one man was dwarfed by the undeniable reality of one woman's triumphs. And the way Crockett answered back, not with words but with wins, would change the conversation forever. To understand the magnitude of that insult, one must first understand the man who delivered it. Richard Posner was not a fringe figure, nor some aging provocateur grasping at attention. For decades, he was the embodiment of intellectual dominance in the American legal world, a jurist whose opinions stretched far beyond the courtroom, shaping law schools, think tanks, and political debates alike. His words carried the weight of scripture in certain circles. Law professors cited him reverently, colleagues deferred to his razor-sharp reasoning, and journalists often marveled at his wit. He was, in every sense, an intellectual giant. But with that towering reputation came an unmistakable arrogance. Posner built his career on dismantling others. He relished in reducing opponents' arguments to rubble, often with language so biting it bordered on cruel. His dissents and essays were not merely analyses of law, they were showcases of verbal dominance. A scholar might spend years crafting a theory, only for Posner to shred it with a single paragraph, delivered in the tone of a man both amused and unimpressed. For admirers, it was brilliance. For critics, it was bullying dressed in the robes of intellect. This pattern of dismissal became his trademark. While other judges cloaked disagreement in polite legalese, Posner cut through with disdain. He did not hesitate to call arguments silly, nonsensical, or unworthy. He treated the courtroom as a stage and the written opinion as a monologue where he and only he held the spotlight. To cross him was to risk humiliation, to challenge him was to invite derision. Over time, his arrogance grew so notorious that even allies whispered about it. He became known not just as a formidable mind, but as someone who often seemed bored by the very field he dominated. When asked to engage with emerging voices, young attorneys, scholars with fresh perspectives, he rarely showed patience. He carried himself as though the law belonged to him, as though everyone else were trespassing on territory only he had the authority to interpret. And yet his reputation kept him untouchable. He had written books that reshaped economics and law, blending disciplines with ease. He had sat on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals for decades, his rulings influencing cases that touched millions of lives. He was feared, respected, and rarely questioned. For many, disagreeing with Posner wasn't worth the cost. It was easier to nod along than risk being crushed under the weight of his dismissive prose. But brilliance and arrogance are uneasy companions. Over time, the cracks began to show. His bluntness, once admired, came to be seen as corrosive. His impatience with tradition, his willingness to break judicial norms, turned admirers into skeptics. When he finally retired, the announcement came with whispers. Was he leaving on his own terms, or was he simply weary of a world that no longer bowed as easily to his authority? Even in retirement, however, Posner's voice lingered. He gave interviews, wrote essays, and delivered cutting remarks that reminded everyone he was still watching, still judging, still towering above the conversation. So when he turned his attention toward Jasmine Crockett, the stage was set. This wasn't just a clash between two professionals. It was the collision of two archetypes, the gatekeeper of legitimacy, armed with decades of prestige, and the challenger whose very existence defied his definition of worth. By calling her a fake lawyer, Posner wasn't merely hurling an insult. He was performing the same act he had perfected for decades, using words to diminish, to invalidate, to erase. But this time, it wasn't a faceless scholar on the receiving end. It wasn't a theoretical argument or an abstract paper. It was a woman whose career had been forged in the fire of lived struggle, whose victories could not be dismissed with a smirk. The arrogance that had once made Posner untouchable now risked becoming his undoing, because while he had spent a lifetime cutting others down, he had never faced an opponent quite like Jasmine Crockett. Unlike the scholars he'd ridiculed or the colleagues he'd brushed aside, she was not bound to the sterile arena of intellectual sparring. She came armed with stories of families defended, communities represented, and legal battles won against all odds. And in this clash, arrogance would meet resilience. Tradition would meet transformation. The intellectual giant would face a challenger who didn't need to outtalk him, she only needed to outlast him. But every Goliath eventually meets a David, and Posner was about to face one who came armed with undeniable victories. Long before she ever stepped into Congress, before the cameras and the bright lights, Jasmine Crockett's life was defined by a fight for space to be heard, to be seen, to be respected. She grew up not in the polished halls of privilege, but in the everyday grit of a world that too often told young black girls to know their place. Her family instilled in her the values of work, dignity, and persistence. They knew the system wasn't built for people like them, but they also knew that with determination, the walls of exclusion could be cracked, even if not fully toppled. Jasmine carried that awareness with her as she pursued law. She wasn't drawn to the courtroom for prestige or glamour. She was drawn to it because it was the battlefield where ordinary people needed a defender. Families threatened with eviction, workers denied their rights, young men and women railroaded by a system that moved faster to punish than to protect. All of them found in her an advocate who refused to back down. For Crockett, practicing law was never just a career. It was a mission, a promise that her presence in the courtroom meant justice would not go unchallenged. She faced obstacles that could have broken lesser spirits, judges who dismissed her arguments before she finished speaking, opposing counsel who spoke over her, questioned her qualifications, or sneered when she stood firm. Yet every dismissal became fuel. She learned quickly that composure was her sharpest weapon, that silence timed with precision could be more devastating than shouting. And in case after case, she proved herself, not by begging for recognition, but by winning. Her courtroom victories weren't small. They carried real consequences. She won cases that protected families from losing everything. She secured justice for clients who had been silenced or ignored. Each triumph was a stone stacked against the towering walls of doubt that society had built around her. Each ruling in her favor was not just a win for her, but for those who had been told justice wasn't meant for them. But Crockett's fight didn't stay confined to courtrooms. She saw how systemic the problems were, how much bigger than any single case. It wasn't enough to defend individuals. She had to challenge the system itself. That conviction pulled her into politics. It wasn't an easy transition. Running for office meant exposing herself to new kinds of scrutiny, whispers that she wasn't polished enough, doubts about whether her voice carried the gravitas required for power. Yet she pressed forward, propelled by the same fire that carried her through every late-night legal brief and every hostile courtroom. Her rise into Congress wasn't a story of shortcuts. It was a story of sacrifice. Campaigns fought on shoestring budgets, endless nights knocking doors, and a message rooted in lived experience, that dignity, fairness, and justice weren't luxuries. They were promises America had failed to keep. Voters saw in her not just a politician but a reflection of their own struggles. She wasn't speaking down to them, she was speaking with them. That authenticity, that unpolished but unbreakable honesty, made her stand out in a political world obsessed with image. She became the voice that didn't flinch, the figure who carried courtroom grit into congressional chambers. And with every speech, every stand, every policy fight, she carved her place further into the narrative of a country still wrestling with whose voices deserve to be heard. Her story resonated beyond her constituents. For immigrant families, she symbolized the idea that America's promise could still be fought for. For young women, she was proof that you didn't have to mute your fire to succeed. For Black professionals, she embodied the fight against a system that too often overlooked their worth. Jasmine Crockett was more than a congresswoman or a lawyer. She was becoming a symbol of perseverance itself. And yet, even with her victories, the insults never fully stopped. Whispers in the halls of power, smirks from colleagues, patronizing tones from opponents. Each was a reminder that the gatekeepers still wanted to decide who belonged. But Crockett never let their disdain derail her. She knew that every slight, every sneer, only sharpened the contrast between her truth and their arrogance. That is why Richard Posner's insult carried such symbolic weight. It wasn't new. It was the oldest trick in the book. A man of prestige attempting to diminish a woman whose power was not bestowed but earned. But unlike others who had wilted under his scorn, Jasmine was no stranger to dismissal. She had been underestimated her entire life, and every time she had turned that underestimation into fuel. Which is why, when Posner dismissed her as a fake lawyer, the insult didn't just sting, it awakened something far more powerful. The air in the chamber shifted after the insult. It was no longer the neutral space of debate, it was an arena, a stage where two figures embodied opposite worlds. Richard Posner leaned into his performance, drawing on decades of experience in controlling the narrative. His words came swift, polished, laced with the confidence of someone who believed his intellect was unassailable. He spoke in the measured cadence of a professor, chastising an unworthy pupil, shaking his head as though the very idea of Jasmine Crockett's credibility was laughable. "You see," he began, voice dripping with condescension, "there is a difference between practicing law and posturing as though you have mastered it. Some people build careers on substance. Others, well, they rely on theatrics." His gaze flicked in her direction, a deliberate signal that the barb was hers to carry. Gasps broke out again, and murmurs spread like ripples through the crowd. This was more than disagreement. It was a public attempt at erasure. Posner thrived in these moments, feeding on the discomfort of those too intimidated to push back. He continued, layering his remarks with references to precedent and doctrine, as if to remind everyone that he had written the very textbooks others studied. But across from him, Jasmine Crockett did not rise to the bait. She sat steady, her posture calm, her eyes focused. The contrast was striking. Where Posner gestured broadly, raising his eyebrows and smirking at his own points, Crockett gave nothing away. The imbalance began to reveal itself. One man straining to prove superiority, one woman refusing to be pulled into his theater. The audience felt it too. The tension wasn't simply in what was said, but in what wasn't. Viewers leaned forward, waiting for her to interrupt, to strike back with the fiery rhetoric she was known for. Instead, she let him keep talking. With every arrogant flourish, every dismissive turn of phrase, Posner was crafting his own undoing. "She doesn't understand the complexities," he scoffed, layering his voice with exaggerated patience. "This is not a matter of slogans or sentimental appeals. The law is a serious discipline, and quite frankly, it requires more than, well, whatever it is she's offering." The insinuation hung there. Whatever she's offering wasn't enough, wasn't real, wasn't worthy. The words cut, but they also revealed him. His arrogance was on full display, and Crockett's restraint transformed the insult into a mirror, reflecting back his own condescension for the world to judge. She knew the value of silence, of letting the opponent expose themselves. And with each passing moment, that silence grew heavier, more powerful, until it felt less like passivity and more like patience. Social media clips captured it instantly. Commenters would later write, "Look at how calm she stayed. He's unraveling and she hasn't said a word." The performance that Posner believed was a showcase of dominance instead read like desperation. It was the sound of a man trying too hard to remind people of his relevance, while the woman he tried to belittle exuded quiet control. Still, the audience waited. How long could she endure the dismissals without breaking? How long before she reminded him, and everyone else, why her name carried weight beyond his approval? The suspense thickened with every pause, every tilt of her head as though she were cataloging his insults like evidence. And that, in truth, was exactly what she was doing. She was letting him build his case, knowing full well that when her turn came, she would dismantle it with precision. But when she finally chose to respond, it wasn't with fury, it was with facts. When Jasmine Crockett finally leaned forward, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Her voice carried no edge of anger, no desperation to prove herself. Instead, it came steady, deliberate, every syllable chosen with the precision of a surgeon making the first incision. "Since we're talking about what it takes to be a real lawyer," she began, her gaze locking on Posner without wavering, "let's talk about results." The audience stirred. Her calmness was disarming, almost unsettling, after the barrage she had just endured. Where Posner had raised his voice to emphasize dominance, Crockett spoke at a measured pace that forced people to lean in. "I have tried cases where families had no one else to stand for them. When eviction notices were slipped under doors like death sentences, I stood in those courtrooms and made sure children kept roofs over their heads. I didn't write books about the law, I lived it, one client at a time." A few heads in the crowd nodded. This wasn't lofty rhetoric, it was lived experience. Posner shifted in his seat, tilting his chin higher as though to signal impatience, but his eyes betrayed something else, calculation. He hadn't expected her to go this route. "And when prosecutors thought they could steamroll young men because they didn't have the money for expensive defense," she continued, her voice tightening with resolve, "I stood there and won dismissals that kept those futures alive. Not because I had the luxury of ivory towers, but because I understood the stakes. The law isn't a game. It's not a debate team trophy. It's the difference between a mother seeing her son at the dinner table or through a prison window." The chamber grew still. Even those who weren't inclined to agree with her felt the weight of her words. She was pulling the fight out of theory and into reality. "And if you want numbers," she let the pause stretch, daring Posner to meet her stare, "I've won more than 80% of my trials, civil and criminal, against firms with deeper pockets, against prosecutors with bigger staffs, wins that weren't supposed to happen, wins that, apparently, a fake lawyer isn't supposed to deliver." Gasps. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not just in admiration but in recognition that the tone of the battle had shifted. This was no longer about insults. It was about receipts. Posner adjusted his glasses, a tick that cameras would replay endlessly in the days to come. He pressed his lips together, but no words came. "And then I stepped into politics," Crockett pressed on. "Not because I needed another title, but because I saw too many people losing faith in a system that treated them as disposable. And what did I do? I won there too. Against moneyed opponents, against doubts that I didn't have the pedigree. I won because people believed in a voice that actually fought for them, because I earned it." Her tone never wavered, but her cadence began to build, each sentence striking like a drumbeat. "You want to talk about legitimacy," she said, leaning slightly closer. "Legitimacy isn't given by the self-appointed guardians of tradition. It's proven in the lives changed by your work. It's proven in victories you can measure. It's proven in the trust of people who don't care how many books you've written, only whether you showed up when it mattered." The audience erupted in scattered applause, quickly hushed, but the energy was undeniable. The tide had turned. Online, the reaction was instantaneous. Clips of her words flooded Twitter. Hashtags trended. #FakeLawyerMyWins, Crockett vs. Posner, receipts over rhetoric. Memes popped up of Posner's stunned expression, side by side with Crockett's steady gaze, captions reading, when the facts clap louder than words. Commentators seized on the moment. "This is what happens when arrogance meets results," one cable host declared. Posner underestimated her, and she just turned his insult into a national headline. Another op-ed would later call it, "The courtroom takedown America didn't know it needed." Back in the room, Crockett pressed the point home. "So if the question is whether I'm a real lawyer," she said, her voice softening but cutting deeper, "I'll let the families who still have homes answer that. I'll let the young men who still have futures answer that. I'll let the voters who sent me to Congress answer that, because their verdict is the only one that matters." Silence, heavy, profound silence. Not the silence of dismissal this time, but of recognition. Posner opened his mouth, then closed it again. The man who had prided himself on always having the sharpest words suddenly found none. The imbalance that had defined the earlier exchange was gone. Now, it was his arrogance against her evidence, and the evidence was overwhelming. Social media continued to roar. Short clips of her final lines spread like wildfire, each caption daring viewers not to feel the surge of vindication. "This is bigger than her," one viral tweet read. "This is about all of us who have ever been called fake when we were more real than they could handle." By the time the moment ended, the shift was complete. Posner's insult no longer defined the narrative. Jasmine Crockett's victories did. And as the silence settled, America realized this wasn't just a clapback, it was a reckoning. The moment the exchange ended, the air in the room felt different. What had started as a lopsided sparring match with an aging titan dismissing a younger challenger had transformed into something seismic. People didn't just witness a clapback. They felt the shockwaves of a cultural reset beginning to ripple outward. Within minutes, the clip was online. Twitter lit up like a lightning storm. One video of Crockett's steady delivery, "Legitimacy isn't given, it's proven," had 500,000 views in less than an hour. The hashtag #FakeLawyerMyWins climbed the trending charts, followed by receipts over rhetoric. Even late-night comedians jumped in, replaying Posner's stunned silence with sound effects and captions. What was meant as an insult had become his legacy moment. The image of an intellectual giant staring helplessly as a younger woman dismantled him with nothing but facts. Journalists were quick to seize the narrative. A Washington Post headline declared, "Crockett shreds fake lawyer smear with Courtroom Record." The New York Times ran with, "When wins speak louder than words." Opinion pages filled with think pieces about the deeper meaning of the clash, the arrogance of entrenched power versus the validation of lived experience. Commentators pointed out the symbolism. Posner, the emblem of elitist dismissal, versus Crockett, the embodiment of communities long silenced but never defeated. Cable news picked up the footage in a loop. On one panel, a conservative analyst tried to downplay Crockett's response, but even he admitted, Posner gave her the opening, and she made him look small. A progressive commentator shot back, "Small. She buried the insult and built a monument to resilience on top of it." On the ground, Crockett's supporters celebrated the way only a grassroots movement can. Community centers where she had once volunteered screened the clip on projectors. Church congregations replayed it after Sunday service, their members nodding and clapping at her words about dignity and legitimacy. For many, it wasn't just her victory, it was theirs. People who had been written off, mocked, or told they didn't belong felt like someone had spoken directly for them. Meanwhile, Posner's defenders retreated. Online, their attempts to spin the narrative faltered. Hashtags mocking Crockett were drowned out by memes that immortalized her poised expression. Even those who once admired Posner's sharp tongue began acknowledging he had gone too far, that he had underestimated an opponent who didn't just fight back, she won. The insult itself, "fake lawyer," mutated into something new. Instead of diminishing Crockett, it became a rallying cry. Supporters proudly labeled themselves fake in solidarity, using the term the way past generations reclaimed slurs meant to shame. T-shirts appeared within days, "Fake Lawyer," Real wins. Stickers, posters, and profile pictures followed. What had been designed as a weapon became a badge of honor. And in this shift, something larger emerged. The clash was no longer about just two figures. It was about what America valued. Were credentials measured in titles and elitist approval, or in the tangible victories that changed real lives? Crockett's triumph forced the question into the open, and the answer was playing out in the reaction of millions. Editorials framed it as a generational handoff. "This isn't merely Crockett defeating Posner," one columnist wrote. "It's a symbol of what happens when gatekeepers of legitimacy underestimate those who earned theirs in the fire of real struggle." Even critics had to admit that the optics were damning. Posner, the man who had reduced countless legal scholars to silence, was now remembered less for his decades on the bench and more for the night a so-called fake lawyer dismantled him with proof of her work. For Crockett, the effect was immediate and profound. Donations surged. Her office fielded messages from supporters across the country who saw her not just as their representative, but as a cultural champion. For young law students, especially women and people of color, her words became a mantra, evidence that they didn't need permission from the establishment to prove their worth. What Posner intended as a scar had become her shield. What he aimed to belittle became the very foundation of her power. But Crockett didn't stop there. She turned the insult into something larger, a universal lesson. In the days that followed, as the noise of headlines and hashtags settled into a steady hum, Crockett did something remarkable. She refused to let the story end as a mere viral clash. Instead, she reframed the insult and her response into something far bigger than herself. Standing before a packed town hall, she spoke not of Posner nor even of his words, but of what those words revealed. "Every one of us," she began, "has been told at some point that we don't belong, that our victories don't count, that our story isn't valid because it doesn't look like theirs. But legitimacy isn't stamped by someone else's approval. It's carved by the work we do, the lives we touch, and the change we fight for." The room erupted in applause, but she continued calmly, her voice steady, almost reverent. "You see, dignity isn't a gift. It's not a title to be granted from on high. Dignity is earned every single time we rise when others try to push us down. And perseverance is the proof that no insult, no matter how sharp, can cut deeper than the truth of who we are." For those who had followed her journey from courtroom battles where she defended the voiceless, to the halls of Congress where she stood her ground, her words resonated as more than rhetoric. They were lived truth. Each insult hurled at her had been a test, and each time she met it not with fury but with resolve. Each dismissal had become a stepping stone. Each setback, a chapter in her larger testimony. And as she told it, the moral became clear. Substance always outweighs slander. Results always eclipse ridicule. 1,000 cutting words could never erase even a single victory that transformed lives. The story shifted. No longer was this about Posner's arrogance or Crockett's rebuttal. It was about a universal human struggle, the fight to be seen, to be valued, to prove one's worth in a world that too often tries to erase it. Crockett's lesson was not just for the legal profession, not just for politics, but for anyone who had ever been underestimated. Her supporters carried that lesson forward. Students quoted her in graduation speeches. Organizers repeated her words at rallies. Parents pointed to her example when teaching their children about resilience. In communities where self-doubt had been seeded by generations of exclusion, her story planted something new: affirmation. And in that moment, what began as an insult became a symbol. Richard Posner thought he could reduce Jasmine Crockett with two cutting words: fake lawyer. But in the end, it was he who was diminished not by insults, but by the weight of undeniable victories stacked against him. Crockett didn't need to shout, didn't need to match his arrogance with outrage. She simply let her record, her resilience, and her results speak louder than anything he could hurl her way. And that's the lesson at the heart of this story. Truth always outlasts arrogance. Dignity always outshines dismissal. The legacy that endures isn't the insult, it's the perseverance, the fight, the wins that no one can erase. If Posner's words were meant to humiliate, they ended up doing the opposite. They spotlighted the strength of a woman who rose above them, and in doing so, they gave millions of people a reason to believe in their own worth. That's why this moment matters. It's bigger than one debate, bigger than one clash of personalities. It's about all of us who have been told we're not enough and proving, again and again, that we are more than enough. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you that arrogance can fall and resilience can rise, don't let it stop here. Share this video. Spread this message. Be part of the movement that says dignity, justice, and truth will always carry the day. Because as Jasmine Crockett proved, victories speak louder than insults. And the more we lift up those victories, the stronger we all become. Subscribe, stay with us, and let's keep telling the stories that remind America who we are and who we're meant to be.